September 1943, North Atlantic, 19-18 hours. The ocean looked quiet enough to trust. Dusk had settled over the Atlantic in slow layers of fading light. The horizon blurred between grey clouds and darkening water, and the wind had softened to a low, steady push across the surface. For the crew of the German submarine, this was the safest part of the day. Nightfall meant survival. Submarines of the era depended on batteries when submerged, and those batteries drained quickly during evasive maneuvers. Every U-boat eventually needed to surface, raise the diesel engines, recharge power, and replenish fresh air. But surfacing carried danger. Aircraft patrols hunted aggressively during daylight hours, scanning the ocean for the faint silhouette of a submarine hull or the brief wake of a periscope. So U-boat commanders developed routine instincts. Surface near dusk. Recharge quickly. Disappear before dawn. At 19-20 hours, the submarine broke the surface smoothly. Diesel engines roared awake almost immediately. The deck hatch opened, and several sailors climbed onto the narrow steel platform to take fresh air and begin lookout rotations. The sea remained calm. No aircraft engines. No distant shapes in the sky. Just the long Atlantic horizon and gathering twilight. Inside the control room, the commander studied the chart. If the batteries charged quickly enough, they could resume patrol before midnight. For the moment, everything appeared routine. But routine was exactly what Allied patrol planners were counting on. High above the cloud layer, a long-range patrol bomber was already searching the same stretch of ocean. The aircraft had left its base hours earlier, flying a wide anti-submarine sweep across shipping lanes where German U-boats were known to operate. Radar aboard the aircraft had detected something faint minutes before. A small contact on open water. Too small for a convoy ship. Too isolated to be debris. The pilot altered course slightly. Below, the submarine continued charging batteries. Lookouts scanned the sky again. Still nothing. The ocean was quiet. And then the lookout froze. Aircraft! The shout came barely a second before the sound followed. Engines screaming through low cloud. The patrol bomber burst out of the grey sky almost directly overhead. The calm Atlantic vanished instantly. Because when aircraft attack submarines on the surface, there is no warning period. There is only impact. And within seconds, the ocean would erupt. The warning came too late. The patrol bomber burst through the low cloud ceiling less than 1,000 meters from the submarine. Its engines roared across the water, and the aircraft's shadow flashed briefly over the U-boat's deck. For the men outside, there was barely time to react. Alarm, aircraft! Sailors dove for the open hatch, while the officer on watch shouted the order every submariner knew by instinct. Crash dive! Inside the control room, the commander had already heard the engines. The sound was unmistakable, too loud, too fast, and far too close. Dive, dive! Klaxons screamed through the submarine as crewmen rushed to their stations. Valves opened, ballast tanks flooded. The steel hull began to sink beneath the surface. But aircraft attacks against surface submarines were designed around speed. The bomber's crew had already lined up their run. From the cockpit, the pilot could clearly see the narrow grey hull beginning to submerge. A wake spread outward as the submarine tried to slip beneath the Atlantic. The bombardier released the depth charges. 4 dark shapes dropped in quick succession, splashing into the water just as the submarine disappeared below the surface. Inside the U-boat, the descent had barely begun. Water rushed over the hull as the last section of deck slipped under the waves. The commander gripped the periscope column, waiting for the moment every submariner feared. The explosions came seconds later. The first blast slammed into the submarine like a giant hammer. Lights flickered, gauges rattled violently, crewmen staggered against bulkheads as the pressure wave rolled through the hull. Then came the second detonation, and the third, and the fourth. Each explosion threw another shock through the boat, turning the calm ocean above into a violent, invisible battlefield. Tools crashed to the floor, pipes shuddered, a light bulb burst, showering glass across the control room deck. The submarine plunged deeper, ballast tanks filling as the commander forced the dive faster. Depth 40 meters, 50-60. Above them, the bomber circled, watching the disturbed water where the explosions had erupted. Oil streaks and bubbles churned across the surface. But aircraft crews knew something important about submarines. The first attack rarely destroyed them. It forced them down. And once a submarine was forced deep, the hunt could begin. Inside the U-boat, the crew waited tensely for the next explosion. Because when the sea explodes from above, the attack rarely ends with the first charges. Sometimes that is only the beginning. Inside the submarine, the first instinct was silence. After a crash dive, every movement mattered. Engines reduced to minimal revolutions. Voices dropped to whispers. Even footsteps were controlled, boots lifted carefully from steel decking. Noise could betray position. The commander studied the depth gauge. 70 meters. Not deep enough to feel safe, but deep enough to survive the initial blast pattern. The hull creaked slightly as pressure increased. Around him, the crew waited. No one spoke the obvious thought. The aircraft above had seen exactly where they went under. Above the surface, the patrol bomber circled slowly. From altitude, the ocean revealed clues invisible from the submarine below. The earlier explosions had churned white foam across the water, and a faint trail of bubbles still drifted outward from the dive point. The pilot throttled back slightly, banking into a slow arc. The bomber was not built to sink submarines in one pass. It was built to track them. Inside the aircraft, the radar operator studied the surface returns carefully. A surface submarine would appear clearly on radar, but once submerged, the signal disappeared. Instead, they relied on observation. Oil streaks, bubble trails, disturbed water patterns. The bomber circled lower. For several minutes, nothing happened. Inside the submarine, that silence felt heavier than the explosions. Any propellers? The commander asked quietly. The hydrophone operator shook his head. No surface ships. Which meant only one hunter remained. Aircraft. And aircraft hunts were unpredictable. At 19:26 hours, the hydrophone operator raised a hand suddenly. Aircraft engines still overhead. The commander closed his eyes briefly. The bomber had not left. Above them, the pilot studied the fadding disturbance on the water. The submarine's dive point was still visible, but currents and wave action were already smoothing the surface. If the submarine had moved too far from that position, the next attack would miss. But if it remained nearby, the bombardier armed the second set of depth charges. The bomber made another attack run. Inside the U-boat, the commander sensed the danger instinctively. Hard port rudder, slow speed. The submarine shifted course gently, trying to slip away from the original dive point without creating detectable noise. For a moment, the ocean above remained quiet. Then the hydrophone operator whispered the word every submariner dreaded. Falling. A split second later, the ocean exploded again. The warning came from the hydrophone operator. Falling. Inside a submarine, that single word carries immediate meaning. It means depth charges have already left the aircraft above and are descending through the water. There is no time left to outrun them. Only time to endure them. The commander reacted instantly. Dive deeper, full ballast. Compressed air roared through the ballast system as the submarine angled downward. The hull tilted slightly as the bow dropped toward darker water below. Depth gauges moved steadily. 80 meters, 90. Then the first explosion struck. The shockwaves slammed into the hull with brutal force. The submarine lurched sideways as though struck by a massive hammer. Lights flickered again, plunging parts of the control room briefly into darkness before emergency lamps steadied. A pipe burst somewhere aft with a metallic crack. Then the second detonation followed almost immediately. The crew braced instinctively, hands gripping railings, shoulders pressed against steel walls as the hull vibrated violently. Tools fell from hooks and skidded across the deck plates. The third blast sounded closer. A deep, hollow concussion rolled through the submarine from bow to stern. The pressure wave seemed to squeeze the air from every compartment. Depth 100 meters. The commander nodded. Deeper water offered slight protection from near-surface detonations, but depth charges could be set to explode at various levels, and the bomber above had already seen where the submarine had gone under, which meant the attack pattern was only approximate. Luck still played a role. The fourth explosion shook the submarine so violently that a gauge shattered, glass spraying across the control room floor. Somewhere in the forward compartment, a sailor shouted that a minor leak had opened along a pipe seam. Damage control crews moved immediately. Not running, not shouting, just controlled, disciplined motion. Because panic inside a submarine is as dangerous as the explosions outside. Above them, the bomber completed its attack run and climbed slightly. The sea below had erupted again in white columns and boiling foam. From the aircraft's perspective, the detonations had landed close enough to disrupt the submarine's dive path. But the bomber crew could not see what was happening beneath the surface. Inside the U-boat, the explosions slowly faded into distant rumbling echoes. The commander listened carefully. If the aircraft believed the attack successful, it might leave. If not, another attack run would follow. And the crew knew something else about anti-submarine aircraft. Unlike destroyers, aircraft carried only limited depth charges, which meant every explosion above them brought the bomber closer to running out. But until that happened, the submarine remained trapped beneath a hunter that could see the ocean far better than they could. And the sky was still directly above them. For the next several minutes, nothing exploded. Inside the submarine, that silence was almost worse. Explosions at least meant the attack pattern was happening and would eventually end. Silence meant the aircraft above might still be watching. The commander held the boat steady at 120 meters. The hull creaked under the increased pressure, a constant metallic whisper that every submariner learned to ignore. "Damage report," he asked quietly. A petty officer stepped forward. "Minor leak sealed forward compartment, one gauge destroyed, no major flooding." The commander nodded. For the moment, the submarine was still intact. But the real problem remained above them. The hydrophone operator adjusted his headphones, listening carefully to the ocean through sensitive acoustic equipment. After a few seconds, he spoke. Aircraft still circling. The engines were faint but unmistakable, which meant the bomber had not yet abandoned the hunt. Above the Atlantic surface, the patrol aircraft moved in slow circles, scanning the water carefully. The earlier explosions had churned the ocean violently, but now the surface was calming again. And calm water reveals clues. The radar operator leaned forward. Possible oil trace, slight disturbance. The pilot banked the aircraft lower. Submarines rarely escape aircraft by speed. Underwater they move slowly, conserving battery power and avoiding cavitation noise, which meant the U-boat could not travel far from its dive point. The bomber crew knew that. Inside the submarine, the commander considered his options. If they stayed still, the aircraft might eventually lose the disturbance trail. But if the bomber guessed their position correctly, another depth charge pattern could land directly overhead. Moving slowly carried risk. Remaining stationary carried risk. Submarine warfare was often a choice between imperfect options. "Slow ahead, 1 knot, he ordered finally. The submarine began creeping forward through dark water, barely faster than ocean currents. Electric motors turned quietly, producing the smallest possible acoustic signature. The intention was simple: drift away from the dive point. Confuse the bomber's next estimate. Minutes passed. No explosions followed. Inside the submarine, men began to breathe slightly easier. Perhaps the aircraft had exhausted its depth charges. Perhaps it had lost the trail. But just as that thought settled into the control room, the hydrophone operator stiffened again. He raised a hand slowly. "Engines approaching." The bomber had not left. It had only been repositioning. And somewhere above the dark Atlantic, another attack run was beginning. At 19:34 hours, the bomber descended again through the low clouds. From above, the pilot believed he had found the submarine's new position. The water showed faint disturbance lines, barely visible, but enough to justify another attack. The bombardier released the remaining depth charges. Inside the submarine, the hydrophone operator heard them immediately. "Falling." The commander reacted without hesitation. "Hard starboard, dive deeper." The submarine tilted downward again, electric motors pushing slightly faster despite the risk of noise. The crew braced for another series of concussions. The first explosion followed seconds later. It struck farther away than the previous pattern. The second blast was closer, but still not direct. 2 more detonations rolled through the water, sending pressure waves across the hull, but failing to strike the submarine directly. When the rumbling finally faded, the control room remained intact. The bomber had expended its final weapons. Above the ocean, the aircraft climbed again, its attack complete. The submarine had survived the second run. But survival did not yet mean escape. At 19:34 hours, the bomber descended again through the low clouds. From above, the pilot believed he had found the submarine's new position. The water showed faint disturbance lines, barely visible, but enough to justify another attack. The bombardier released the remaining depth charges. Inside the submarine, the hydrophone operator heard them immediately. "Falling." The commander reacted without hesitation. "Hard starboard, dive deeper." The submarine tilted downward again, electric motors pushing slightly faster despite the risk of noise. The crew braced for another series of concussions. The first explosion followed seconds later. It struck farther away than the previous pattern. The second blast was closer, but still not direct. 2 more detonations rolled through the water, sending pressure waves across the hull, but failing to strike the submarine directly. When the rumbling finally faded, the control room remained intact. The bomber had expended its final weapons. Above the ocean, the aircraft climbed again, its attack complete. The submarine had survived the second run. But survival did not yet mean escape. Shortly after 20:05 hours, the commander gave the order. "Prepare to surface." The submarine rose slowly through the dark water. Ballast tanks expelled compressed air as the boat climbed toward the surface where it had nearly been destroyed less than an hour earlier. At 20:09 hours, the U-boat broke the surface again. Night had fully arrived. Clouds covered the sky, and the Atlantic stretched black and empty in every direction. Lookouts climbed carefully onto the deck. No aircraft. No ships. Only wind and waves. The diesel engines started once more, their rumbling echoing across the dark ocean as the batteries began charging again. The submarine had survived. But the crew understood something important now. The sky could no longer be trusted. By 1943, the Atlantic War had changed. In the early years of the conflict, submarines had often operated freely on the surface at night or during twilight hours. Aircraft coverage was limited, and the vast ocean made detection difficult. But Allied technology was improving rapidly. Long-range patrol bombers now roamed areas once considered safe. Radar aboard those aircraft could detect surfaced submarines far beyond visual range. And cloud cover or fading daylight no longer guaranteed concealment. The submarine commander realized that his routine, surfacing at dusk to recharge batteries, had nearly cost him the entire boat. The ocean had not changed, but the sky had. And in the modern Atlantic War, danger could arrive from above without warning. The U-boat believed the sky was clear. That belief lasted less than a minute. For most of naval history, threats came from the horizon. Ships watched the sea for enemy vessels approaching across the water. But by 1943, the battlefield had expanded vertically. Aircraft had turned the sky into an extension of the ocean. Submarines that once hunted convoys from the surface now had to fear engines above the clouds. A single patrol bomber could force a submarine to dive, damage it with depth charges, or track it long enough for destroyers to arrive. The calm Atlantic that evening had concealed that change. To the U-boat crew, the water had looked peaceful. But the real danger had been hidden in the clouds. When the bomber appeared, the ocean itself seemed to explode. Depth charges turned quiet water into a battlefield within seconds. The submarine survived. But the lesson remained clear. In the new Atlantic War, survival depended not only on what lay beneath the waves, but on what might suddenly appear above them.